Hi, my name is Taryn and welcome to A British Audiophile and my review of the Pro-Ject MaiA S2 integrated amplifier. This thing, look at it, isn't it cute? It's about the size of a cigar box. So how do you get a proper amplifier this big? Well, it's Class D for starters, so no heat sinks taking up space. It's got an off-board switch mode power supply, that's cheating really. And it only produces 25 watts of power into 8 ohms, 38 watts into 4 ohms. What? Class D switch mode power supply, 25 watts power. Is anybody still watching? This thing's got to deal with more prejudices than Caitlyn Jenner. And what am I doing reviewing it? Well, I'm all for supporting minorities. Hello. And quite frankly, I listened to it a couple of times in different settings and I was quite impressed with the overall sound. You can only get a general impression until you get it home, of course. So let's see if this thing's any good. The Pro-Ject MaiA S2 retails for £449 here in the UK. It's 206mm wide, some 165mm deep and only 38mm high. It produces 25 watts into 8 ohms and 38 watts into 4 ohms. It's an all-metal casework and front faceplate. There's no plastic here, and that helps to reduce interference. It's available in the black that you see here, but also in silver. Starting with the controls on the front face here, on the extreme left-hand side you have the power button. If you press it, it'll power itself up after a couple of seconds, and it'll do the same when powering down. Next to that you have the IR sensor. Adjacent to that is the headphone socket, that's 6.3mm, and it has a very nice motorized volume control, which I'll just adjust here using the remote control. It's very smooth in operation, whether you adjust it manually or using the remote. And I'll just show you the remote control. That's a relatively inexpensive credit card size remote that allows you to switch it on and off, change inputs and turn the volume up and down. It's fairly basic in operation. On this side you have 9 inputs, yeah that's right, 9 inputs including Bluetooth, USB, digital inputs, line level inputs and a phono preamp input that will handle moving magnet and high output moving coils. You can adjust the inputs using the buttons or with the remote control. Looking at the back you can see all the connections. Let's start from the left hand side again, and you have a phono connection with a ground terminal to connect to your turntable, and next to that you have 2 line level inputs. Adjacent to that is a coaxial digital input and an optical digital input. Then you've got your Bluetooth input and a USB input, and that I think pretty much covers everything that you're likely to use, certainly for most people in any case. Above that, the 2 silver things that you can see, well the first one is a 3.5mm stereo connection in for any cables that you have with 3.5mm connectors, and similarly there's a 3.5mm stereo connection out that you can use to connect to a subwoofer, external amplifier or a active speaker. On the right hand side you have the speaker terminals. They're quite dinky in size, so you're not going to be able to connect them to massive spade connectors or banana plugs, but they're going to be fine with the regular stuff. And next to that you have your 20 volt power connection for your off-board power supply. I'll just quickly show you the power supply. So it's a pretty standard inexpensive power supply running 20 volts and up to 3 amps from a Chinese manufacturer. Pro-Ject do offer a power supply upgrade to one of their own power supplies. That costs £189 and it may be worthwhile, but I don't have that here. So looking at the inside you'll see a nicely laid out, clean looking circuit board with a bunch of components on there. So let's start with this section in the top right hand corner here. That is the phono preamp. Now the phono preamp is just lifted out of Pro-Ject's entry level preamp, the Phono Box E. And by all accounts it's supposed to be a decent sounding phono preamp. It retails for about £50 in its own right. And one thing you'd expect from Pro-Ject is the ability to build a decent turntable and build a decent phono preamp. I didn't test it because I haven't got a turntable. Next to that you have the 2 other line level inputs, and this section here is the DAC. You can see the Cirrus Logic chips there. There's 2 of them. They're the 4.4s, and that's the XMOS controller for the USB interface. Now the DAC here again is lifted out of Pro-Ject's entry-level range, the Box E, and it would retail for around £70 in its own right. And in fairness, it's fairly decent sounding. Normally what you get with inbuilt DACs and phono preamps on amplifiers at this stage are things that don't sound particularly good. They're almost an apology on behalf of the manufacturer, and they're added just for convenience, but that isn't the case here. It's a fairly decent sounding DAC and a worthy addition in this case. Now if you follow this cable down, that's your Bluetooth connection here, and I presume this end here is something to do with the preamp. It makes sense because it's right next to the switch controls. This is your headphone connection, and this on the left hand side is your output stage. You can see the heat sinks there, and that's based on the Flying Mole Class D modules. I always advise people to stay clear of reviews where someone raves about a product but doesn't compare it to anything else. But the reality is, doing this YouTube gig, it's not always possible to do a direct product comparison. You need to have something comparable in at the same time. Where that hasn't been possible, I've had to compare a product to something above its price point or below its price point just to give it some kind of context. That isn't the case here. I have the IOTA VX SA3 that I reviewed a few weeks ago, and that retails for £400. Project MaiA S2 is £450, but it also has a couple of extra features in the Bluetooth and USB DAC that aren't standard on the IOTA VX. I've also got a couple of other amplifiers in and around this price point that have reviews pending, and I want to make this point that around this £400 to £600 price point, manufacturers have figured out how to make a fairly linear sounding amplifier, if that's what their design goal has been. So the differences in sound with a lot of amplifiers around this price point are certainly not anywhere near as dramatic as they are with loudspeakers. There are differences, they're just more subtle. The overall tonal characteristic of the MaiA S2 is very flat and even. It doesn't draw attention to itself in the low frequencies, in the mid frequencies, or the high frequencies. And the same can be said to some extent of the IOTA VX SA3 as well. There are differences between the two amplifiers though, most dramatically in the low-end bass performance. And in this regard, the IOTA VX has it all over the MaiA S2. Bass performance on the IOTA has more weight, it has more speed, it can hang on to rhythms more easily and deliver them with more authority. In comparison, the MaiA S2 is softer and looser in its bass response. The MaiA S2 pulls back in the mid-range though. Both amplifiers have very good instrument separation and leading edges of notes are very well defined. But the IOTA VX has a slightly lean quality in the lower mid-range that robs male vocals of ultimate authority. That isn't the case with the MaiA S2, they're produced very faithfully. The IOTA VX also has a slight edge in the upper mid-range that makes bright recordings a little tiresome over a period of time. Again, that isn't the case with the MaiA S2, it has more refinement in that particular area. In terms of high frequencies, again, I'd have to give it to the MaiA S2. Don't get me wrong, both have very good high frequency performance for their price point. The IOTA VX draws a little bit more attention to itself, it's a little more sparkly on top. The MaiA S2 still has all the information there, but it delivers it in a slightly more natural, refined manner. So overall, the highs and mids go to the MaiA and the low-end performance goes to the IOTA VX. In terms of setup and partnering equipment, that's where we need to be a little bit careful here. This is a 25 watt amplifier. Now I know what I say, most people don't need anywhere near the watts they think they need. But what you do need is usable power. We're not talking about a 20 watt Class A amplifier from Sugden or First Watt that's backed up by a huge power supply. This amplifier is backed up by a tiny little switch mode power supply. It's not capable of delivering large amounts of current, and you're going to have to choose your speakers accordingly. So what did I mean by that? Well, I tried the MaiA S2 with my ProAct Response 1 SCs. Now my ProAct Response 1 SCs didn't like this amplifier at all. They sounded dull and lifeless. I think the issue was that the ProAct 1 SCs have an impedance plot that goes up and down quite a bit across the frequency range. Now that places demands on an amplifier in terms of delivering current quickly, and I think that was the issue there. I also tried them with the ATC SCM7s that I have in for review, and they fared a little bit better, but again I didn't think the MaiA S2 had proper grip and control over those speakers either. In fairness, the ATCs have a big whacking magnet structure and they're known to need quite a few watts to get those drivers moving. I suspect that was the issue there. I also tried them with the Triangle Genez trios that you see behind me, and they really sang together. I think the triangles are relatively easy speakers to drive, and there was a nice tonal balance between the MaiA S2 and the trios. I think you need to be sensible about the speakers you choose with this amplifier. Pick something with a sensitivity rating in the high 80s as a minimum. If you want to listen at normal listening levels, you're not going to be able to rock out with this amplifier. That goes without saying. And you also need to exercise a little bit of common sense in terms of the room and setup you place it in. It's not going to drive large speakers in large room. That should be fairly obvious. It's going to be absolutely fine in a desktop situation, and it's also going to be fine in a small room as long as you've chosen your speakers wisely. By far, I think the most important characteristic to get right is to choose a speaker with a relatively flat impedance sweep across the frequency range, so you're not placing too much demands on the power supply. So where did I get to with this dinky little amplifier? Well, it's not far off being a cracking amplifier at its price point. Its mid-range performance and high frequency performance in terms of tonality and refinement are way above what you'd expect from an amplifier at this price point, but it does have a couple of shortcomings. Power on offer means that it won't play particularly loud, and the nature of its power supply, I think, is the reason why you need to choose speakers very carefully. It also lacks a little bit of dynamics and control in the bottom end, and that's why I think it's best suited to a desktop or a semi-near field scenario where that becomes less of an issue. It gets a recommended from this channel for those particular reasons. There's no doubt that you could build a very nice system around this amplifier if you know what you're doing and you choose your speakers carefully. So hopefully you've liked this review. If you do, hit that like button, please share it, and if you haven't subscribed already, please consider subscribing. But for today, for now, a British Audiophile signing off.